So welcome to part 2 of our lecture on the Cold War. All right, so we were just talking about the fear of nuclear war, and this brings up what is called sort of 6 major strategies of the Cold War. And one of them is something called brinkmanship, and this is something that we are very much experiencing in 2017. And brinkmanship is the idea of how countries sort of push each other to use nuclear weapons, hoping that, obviously, that they won't. But this is the idea of how far can you push someone or use the nuclear weapon as a tool to get what you want without using it. And that is known as brinkmanship. Other aspects of the Cold War is spying or espionage, right? So the Cold War is waged in the US with spies from the Central Intelligence Agency, which was created to wage the Cold War internationally. Russia also has their KGB agents who are spying on Americans, infiltrating America, creating propaganda. So both sides are using spies and information from inside of those countries to spread information outside of those countries about those countries. Both the U.S. and Russia are wielding influence by giving other countries money. So we will loan countries money from England to France to Angola to Cuba to try to get them to not be communists. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And the Russians are doing the same thing. They are giving people money to become communist. And each side is making alliances with countries, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Each side is using propaganda. Now, if you are Russian and you wanted to demonstrate the limits of American democracy, you may focus on race and how America was racially unequal, how American people of color in America were not given fair jury treatment. You may focus on these things, and the Russian press often did. So propaganda is used by the Russians to show the rest of the world we're not so equal, we're not so democratic. It's all a hoax. Don't believe the U.S. And the final component to the Cold War is what we call surrogate wars or proxy wars. Again, these are wars where the U.S. or the Soviets will fight or supply money, but we will never directly fight each other. Okay. So what we see is after the Second World War, the alliance between the U.S. and the Soviets have broken down. The U.S. has very different goals in the post-war world. What we want is to have open markets. We want to do that, right, to prevent another depression. So remember, the Great Depression happens because of overproduction, in part because of the First World War. Well, what do people know? We have to keep our engines running at just fast a pace, or we're going to have a depression. So the U.S. is forcing its goods on the rest of the world, and very much using the Cold War as a way to do this. We also are claiming to promote democracy around the world, especially in Asia and Africa, places where previous colonies are now becoming free and independent. And we're also very much afraid of something called the domino effect, and that is any country that shares a border with Russia. And just to give you context, you should see how big Russia is. Again, Russia being the first communist country, any country that shares a border with Russia will become communist. That's Russia. It's huge. Let's see, domino theory. I spelled domino wrong. Boom. Right? So that's Russia. And the domino theory said that any country that bordered Russia would fall to communism. And it sort of looks like it happens, right? So there's Korea. This is China. It does become communist. Um, it then borders this and this. That's Vietnam, which will become communist. Um, so when you look at it from the West, it certainly had some sense of legitimacy. Okay, so all of this is what the US wants. So what does the Soviets want? Well, I'm so glad you asked me that. The Soviets have similar goals, right? They're trying to create security for themselves. They lose so many more people in the Second World War. They lost tens of thousands of people. Um, they very much feared Germany. It had attacked them numerous times. They saw the West as being the attackers. Um, they wanted to also spread communism around the world. So they wanted to expand their borders. They want Eastern Europe. And they also want to make sure that they are not subsumed by the West. And they feel very much that they will be taken over by the West. That is their position. All right. So I spoke a little bit about the Truman Doctrine before, so I won't go into that again. But remember, the whole idea is to contain communism. Anywhere it pops up, we will contain it. So one of the first things that the U.S. does to make the world and its allies against communism is to aid Europe through what's called the Marshall Plan. So the U.S. is going to give a lot of money to Western Europe to rebuild. Most of the war is fought here. So cities are in ruin, towns were destroyed, people are displaced. They need electricity, they need jobs, they need food. So the U.S. is going to provide those immediate needs for these Europeans to help them rebuild, to help them get back on their feet. And again, what the U.S. wants out of this is allegiance, alliance, anti-communist alliance. We talked about this before again, but in 1957, the U.S. points its focus very much on the Middle East and the Eisenhower Doctrine, saying that it will attack any Middle Eastern country that becomes communist, or will defend any Middle Eastern country against a communist attack. This is going to bring the U.S. into a war between Egypt and Egypt over the Suez Canal. And we will also see the British and the French withdrawing from these regions, leaving, again, sort of a question of which direction these countries will go. All right. In Berlin, I mentioned that the country of Germany was split into different zones, and that's what this looks like. In the late 1940s, there is a crisis in Berlin. The Soviets have cut off supplies to people in East or in West Berlin, which is actually occupied by the Americans, strangely enough, because Berlin is the city. But the Americans will airlift, drop things from planes to help feed the German people as an act of humanitarian effort. By 49, the U.S. is calling for the creation of NATO. That's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, still around today. And this is the military alliance that the U.S. leads with England, France, Canada, Denmark, etc., etc. The Soviets have their own pact. This is known, or their own alliance. This is known as the Warsaw Pact. And it included certainly Russia, but other communist countries, Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia. These are all Eastern European satellite countries right here. Poland, Romania, USSR, East Germany. All right. So again, we talked about this before. McCarthy, he is the senator from Wisconsin who claims that there are communists and spies and communists working in the government. And he sets off what's known as a witch hunt to try to snuff out anyone who could have been a communist in the government. Of course, this was a way to get out people who were questioning the system, who were criticizing what was going on. Um, and he was also an alcoholic. So he never actually had any names. He created all this and became very powerful in so doing, but never had much evidence to back up what he said. Um, he is brought down really when he accuses people in the military of being a communist. So it had gone on for a couple of years. He had ruined people's lives. He had ruined careers. And he starts accusing the military, and they sort of put an end to his foolishness. A lot has been written about him, and the play The Crucible, if you ever had to read that, is set in Puritan times, but it is about hysteria, the time of social hysteria that McCarthyism is often associated with. All right. So, as said before, one of the most significant components of the Cold War is not only the creation of nuclear weapons, but then what is known as the proliferation of nuclear weapons, or creating newer, faster, better, more destructive types of bombs. Um, the US makes bombs, then the Russians, and then you'll see other people beginning to make them and explode them and test them. And this has a profound impact on everything, both human psychology to policy to the environment. You know, when you even test these things, it is very harmful to the plants, animals, and humans around. Another aspect of this is the space race. Um, the Russians and the Americans are competing to see who can get into space first. The Soviets are the first to launch a satellite into space that is known as Sputnik. Um, the Soviets are also first to put a man into space. Um, Kennedy, of course, when he becomes president, says we'll go to the moon. The U.S. becomes the first to put a man on the moon in 1969. And the U.S. and the Russians are constantly spying on each other. And an example of that is when in 1960 a U.S. CIA agent is flying over the Soviet Union illegally. He's shot down and taken prisoner. And the Americans have to explain why he's there. And they have to figure out a way to also get him out of Russia. The Cold War, in many ways, makes the federal government more powerful than it had ever been. New agencies are created to wage the Cold War, and the CIA being one of them. Throughout the 1950s, the CIA has a lot of successful operations where they influence elections and they are successful in getting popular support and even taking out candidates, right? I mean, the CIA do very nefarious things around the world. And in 1960, they try to do it in Cuba, and it fails. And it fails miserably. And the CIA try to lead a Cuban revolution against its leader, Fidel Castro, who's a communist, who had successfully ousted America from the island in 1956. So we won it back, basically, and it doesn't work, and the agents are captured, and it very much becomes a very painful loss for America. Okay. Um, the Cold War rages on for decades. In the 1960s, it has a new symbol. The Berlin Wall is constructed by the Soviets to very much keep um, people from leaving and going to the West. Living under communist rule was oppressive. There are no jobs, there's nothing